Good morning, Year 7. Welcome to your first history lesson. It's Mrs. Edwards, or Miss Renee, you might remember me as, taking your first lesson. If you've got any problems, you can email me. If you want to email me any work you've done following this lesson, please do at sedwards@johnfernley.org. Okay, so we're going to start with thinking about the Tudors. Now, you've done a little bit a few weeks ago on the Wars of the Roses and the Battle of Bosworth, so we're going to do a little brief refresher, and then we're going to focus on Henry Tudor because we're looking at how did the Tudors begin. So we need to go right to the beginning. Who was the first Tudor king? How did that happen? And what was he like? Okay, so let's start with some questions that you've already looked at and see what you remember. So you might want to pause now and have a go at answering these 5 questions. So what did the Normans what year did the Normans invade England? Which religion was the most important during the Middle Ages? What year did the Black Death arrive in England? Can you remember the 4 humours? So what are the 4 humours? And the Battle of Bosworth was a battle as part of the what? What was the Battle of Bosworth as part of a greater string of battles? What were they known as? So pause here and have a go at answering those 5 questions. Okay, let's see how you did. So the Normans invaded in 1066. The main religion was Catholicism, or I'd accept Christianity. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. The 4 humours are black bile, yellow bile, phlegm and blood. And the Battle of Bosworth was a part of what? It's the Wars of the Roses. So see if you got 5 out of 5. So today we're going to look at and understand why England went to war with itself a little bit, and we're going to start to explain and evaluate how the Tudor reign began. So who was the first Tudor? How did they do? So it all started with a big royal row, and it began in the early 1400s when England's royal family had been arguing among themselves about who should be king. And we know this isn't the first time this has happened. Look at what happened in 1066. We had 4 different contenders for the throne and they couldn't decide who was going to be king, so they settled it over a battle. And what happened was both sides of the royal family were directly related to King Edward III, and when he died they couldn't decide who should be king. Henry VI was King of England, and he was from the family or the House of Lancaster. But he struggled to control the country and was quite a poor military leader. So he wasn't very good in battle, makes him quite weak. And obviously if you're living in England at this time, you're probably not going to put much faith in him. He also, unfortunately, really suffered with his mental health. And so sometimes he used to have to take periods where he'd go off because it was too much trouble and he just needed a bit of a break. And when this happened once, one of his relatives, or a distant relative from the House of York, was chosen to be protector in Henry's absence. And Richard was his name, and he ruled until Henry recovered. And when he was feeling better and he came back to rule, Richard was then dismissed. But, you know, when you've had a bit of power and you've tasted it, you kind of think, oh, I'd like to keep it. And that was exactly what Richard wanted. He was like, well, you know, I've been protector, I've been like a king, I want to still be king. So he decided to fight King Henry, and eventually Richard was killed, and then a series of battles between the families began. Between 1455 and 1485, and it's between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and each family was represented by a rose. So can you remember which rose represented which family? So we've got a red rose and we've got a white rose. You might want to pause just to remind yourself. Hopefully you got this right. So the Lancasters chose the red rose and the Yorks were the white rose. And if you have a look at this map, this shows the locations of all these different battles during the wars. So the red obviously is the battles won by Lancaster, and the white's the battles won by York. So just pause the video now, and I just want you to have a go, write down, what do you notice about where the locations of these battles are? Where do they tend to be? Is there a bit of a pattern? And which family, based on the number of battles won, looks to be the strongest? Who would you expect to win? So pause now and have a go at answering those 2 questions. Okay, So just to give you a little bit more of an understanding and to see, the key battles that happened during all of these wars of the Roses, there's a really good summary, and I know a lot of you who have been taught by me know that I am a big fan of horrible histories, and they of course have done a War of the Roses report. So if you go on YouTube and type in Horrible Histories War of the Roses report, and you can see that one there. So just here is who's posted it. This is a version that I know works. I've just watched it myself. It's only 3 minutes and 48 seconds long. Pause this video now and go and watch that video and make a few notes just to bring it back to you what you did a couple of weeks ago on the key battles of the Wars of the Roses, just to give you a bit of an understanding. Hopefully you enjoyed that clip and it gave you a little bit of a chuckle as well. So when this was all happening, when we had these Wars of the Roses, it's also known as a civil war, which is one of the key words that we are going to be using, and you will come to know what civil war means a lot more because we're going to look at another civil war in England during the course of year 8. So a civil war is a war between groups of people within the same country. So the country has gone to war with itself. And I found 2 interpretations that talk about what life was like during this period of civil war. So interpretation C says the nobles threw themselves eagerly into the struggle and many battles were fought in England. It was a dreary war for everybody was fighting for their own reasons and men changed sides shamelessly when it suited them. Everyone rejoiced when the Wars of the Roses were over, for indeed it was an unhappy, lawless time. And interpretation D says, for the ordinary English person, the effects of civil war were much less than for the nobles. English life in general was very little affected by the war. There was very little devastation, little pillaging and plundering, and there were no general collapse of law and order. So have a go at these 2 questions that I've put on. So again, pause the video and have a go at answering these 2 in your books or on your paper. So do interpretations C and D agree on any details? If so, can you write them down? And both interpretations talk about the impact of the Wars of the Roses on English people. How do they differ? So what do they disagree about? And again, can you make a note of those in your book? So pause the video and have a go at those 2 questions. So let's see if you got something similar to what I picked out. So I picked out that the nobles, as you can see in both of these, show that the nobles were heavily involved in the battle. So the first one talks about how the nobles threw themselves eagerly into the struggle, as you can see in that first sentence. And then it says, for the ordinary English person, the effects of civil war were much less than for the nobles. So talking about how the nobles impacted them a lot more. So they both agree that the nobles were heavily impacted by the civil war. So both interpretations talk about the impact, but what do they differ on? So I spoke about how interpretation D talks about how little impact there was and that it didn't really affect people's lives. It talks about there was very little devastation, there wasn't much pillaging and plundering, there was no general collapse of law and order, everything was kind of okay. Whereas source C talks about how it was quite a dreary war, everyone was fighting for different reasons, and everyone was so happy when it was over because it was an unhappy, lawless time. So although they're both talking about the same thing, they both have different interpretations, which we know we come across quite a lot of in history. And as we go through in year 8, we're going to look at another civil war and we're going to focus particularly at what life was like. So this is going to help us start to think about that. And also, as you write your journals over the next year and we think about how people were affected, you might be a noble, you might be Lord Joffrey, and therefore you were heavily impacted by this Wars of the Roses, whereas actually if you weren't, if you were just a simple peasant, then actually you might not have noticed anything at all. So the Wars of the Roses ended with the last battle, which was known as the Battle of Bosworth, which you probably have all heard of because you've done it anyway, but before that you might have heard of it. And it happened on the 22nd of August 1485, and the last important member of the Lancaster family decided to challenge Richard III for the crown, and his name was Henry Tudor. And at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor and his Lancaster supporters beat Richard III and the Yorks. Henry then found the king's crown in a hawthorn bush and declared himself the King of England. So Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII and also the first Tudor king on the 22nd of August 1485. So just pause and have a think. You might want to scribble a few notes down in your book. But what should Henry do now in order to end the War of the Roses? Because there's been several battles throughout these sort of 30, 40 years. And after each battle, someone wins, but then another battle happens. So what could Henry do to make sure that he secures his position as this new King of England? And what could he do to make sure there wasn't another battle after it? Have a think and write some ideas down. So let's have a look. What did Henry do? See if you worked out, if you got any of these. So Henry knew that he needed to be really clever, because if he was clever, he wouldn't be challenged again as king and he could become the king for a long period of time, which is what he wanted. So the first thing that Henry did was get married. And he married a lady called Elizabeth of York. And yes, Elizabeth of York, because she was from the York family. So this meant that they had a king from the Lancaster family and a queen from the York family. So obviously if they had children who would then go on to reign, their children would be both from the York and Lancaster family. And that marriage really united the Tudor family and ended the wars. And it was a fair compromise, and people went, yeah, do you know what? That's fair, we'll accept it. And didn't challenge him anymore. Henry also united the York and Lancaster roses and created what we know as the Tudor rose, as you can see just here. Okay, so not only did he unite them in marriage, he symbolised it in the Tudor rose to really make it strong and emphasise the fact that he wanted to be a good king. And there were a few other things that Henry did as he reigned as king. He made sure that he had the best weapons. So he started to develop, making sure he invested in cannons. He wanted the most destructive and most feared weapons in the land. Obviously, that would help keep people away and make sure people were a little bit scared of him, and showed that he had quite a bit of power. The next thing he did was he banned private armies. So some powerful men in England had their own private armies, and Henry knew that if they wanted to, they could use their private armies against him and there could be another battle. So what he did is he made sure that he banned them, and one rich lord who failed to get rid of his private army was actually fined £10,000. So he was really serious about what he wanted to do, and he made sure that other people knew how serious he was. The next thing he did was he made deals with other countries, and he once made sure that other countries were happy to pay him. He got the Parliament to give him money to fight the French, and then got the French king to actually pay him not to fight. He was very, very clever. He forced people to give him money. So Henry made the rich people in the kingdom pay him heavy taxes, which meant that he could have lots of money, which meant that he could get more weapons and more cannons, strengthen his army, and forcing them to give over their money meant that they were going to struggle to have the lavish lifestyle they'd had before and kind of keep them in check. And then finally, he made sure that everyone knew he was king. So he was really careful with money, but he also spent a little bit of money so that people could see that he had lavish parties, he had lots of entertainment. He made sure that the Tudor rose that he created appeared all over the country in different churches, paintings, palaces and cathedrals. So what I'd like to do is, using all this information, I'd like to have a go at the following tasks. So in a moment you can pause the video and you can have a go at writing these in your book or on your paper. So I would like to make a brief list of all the actions that Henry VII took to secure his kingdom. So what did he do to make sure that he would be a secure king and not risk another war? Then I want you to explain why the following actions that Henry took were important. So why was it important that he married Elizabeth of York? Can you explain why it was important that he banned those private armies? What did it mean? And why was it important that he made lots of money to be a secure king? What did that help? What consequences came from that? Then, if you want, I've put an extra task on. So using the information from today, but also from your lesson a couple of weeks ago, can you write a report on the Wars of the Roses, or a newspaper report, or you could do it as a radio report. You can write as though you are on the side of the House of Lancaster or the House of York and explain what happened, who's winning the wars, and why you think they are winning them. So pause the video and have a go at those questions. Okay, and just to finish up our lesson today, can you have a go at answering these 5 plenary questions? All the answers were on the slides that, on the video that we've just watched. So what were the names of the 2 houses who were fighting each other? Who were the 2 men who were fighting for the crown in the final Battle of Bosworth? What is a civil war? On what date was the Battle of Bosworth fought? And where was the crown found before being placed on Henry's head? So pause, have a go at those 5 questions and see if you get them right. So these are our answers. York and Lancaster, Richard III and Henry Tudor, a civil war was a war between groups of people within the same country. It happened, Battle of Bosworth, on 22nd of August 1485, and the crown was found in a hawthorn bush. That's the end of today's lesson. Thank you very much for listening, Year 7. And next week we're going to have a look at our next Tudor. Let's see if you guess if it's the correct one that comes to your heads. See you later. Bye bye.